What's up, everybody? BigSweetC here with you. Got a special little video for you. Today, I kind of want to talk about a subject that we've been talking about fairly recently on the streams, and that's the state of game design today. So what brought this up was I was playing Remnant from the Ashes. We're still streaming that over on Twitch, so if you haven't yet, do me that favor, run over to Twitch. Twitch.tv/BigSweetC, hit that follow button and notification bell over there so you know when I do go live, usually Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays. But enough shameless self-promotion. We are playing Remnant, and we came across this event. Now, I thought it was like a boss, so I thought I had to do this. Apparently, it's just an event, so it's not part of the actual main storyline. But nonetheless, it still pertains and leads into what I want to talk about today, because it does seem ridiculous. So you go into this thing and you have to destroy these 3 towers, and to do so, while you're doing so, these endless spawns just keep coming out of the walls, and they keep running at you. They're like the close-up melee guys that just come and swipe you in. When they hit you, they stun you and all this stuff. Half the guys that are there, as they get progressively more difficult, they start coming in invisibly, and they like teleport, so you can't even tell until they're about 2 feet in front of you, and then by then it's probably too late. And it's just this horde of ridiculousness. And even when I had a friend who's like twice the level that I am, it was still insanely difficult and just utter frustration and garbage. Now, it turns out I have no idea how you're supposed to know this other than me looking it up in the wiki. Turns out if you go in there and you just keep your eyes on the floor, you don't look at the walls, for whatever reason, they don't trigger the enemy. It doesn't trigger the enemies. So if you walk in like I'm doing here in the video, face down, and just use the little mini map to figure out where you're going and where the 3 orbs that you have to destroy are, as long as you keep your face down, you don't look at the walls, you can move around the room about as free as a bird, and none of the enemies will ever spawn. Now, like I said, outside of the wiki, I have no idea how you're supposed to know that this is a thing in the game. The only thing I can think of is there's a gentleman kind of hanging out in the forest outside of this little event cave that tells you that you shouldn't be talking now, you should be listening. And there are some occasional, what I think are like notification bings in the audio that allow you to know where you're going and that you're on the right track. So that's the only thing that I can think of in the game that actually is meant to let you know that you can do this. Now, as a huge Dark Souls fan, this kind of stuff actually fascinates me a lot. Like, having to go to the wiki or like talk with friends about how they did it, that is a love of mine from video games since the dawning of Final Fantasy, right? And, you know, like, even if you had, like, the player's guide with, like, the original Final Fantasy for Nintendo, they have you go in a very specific direction, whereas, like, my friend was like, dude, why don't you go in this way and you can get all the better stuff a lot sooner, you know? So, like, there is that inherent idea of kind of keeping things secret to bring the community together, right? And I love that about this game. But there's also other things that, you know, lead me to believe that this is what I like to call third-grade poor game design. So happens to be this, like, fascination that every game has to be the most incredibly difficult game of all time. And if it's not incredibly frustrating and difficult, it's not worth making. But instead of, like, doing the Dark Souls route, where they make the gameplay hard, or like the getting over it with Foggy Bennett or whatever the dude's name is, where you literally have a pickaxe and you're stuck in this like pot, and all you have is the pickaxe to get you over these rocks, right? So they limit the amount of abilities you can do to increase difficulty. Whereas like these other games, a la Destiny, Outriders, they just throw more swarms at you. Right, they're just like, oh, well, it's not tough enough. Well, here's 8,000 more enemies for you to kill, and they're all, well, here's is this enemy at another 5 difficulty levels ahead of you, and he swings, and regardless of where you're at, if he swings in front, he still hits you behind him, and you can't get away, and he can jump halfway across the screen, and like it just seems like poor game design, because it's like instead of trying to make the game more difficult, they just throw more shite at you, and they call it difficulty. That's lazy. They'd be like, well, you know, I mean, I wanted a really, really big sandwich. So, you know, instead of like, you know, adding a bunch of stuff, I just threw one meat on there like 100 times. Right? So, like, you didn't really make like a big sandwich. You just made a sandwich with a ton of meat. Does that make sense? I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one that kind of like thinks in this critical aspect of it. But it seems to go across the board. Now, if that's the idea, you know, the mob boss games, like that, I can be okay with that. I don't think they're... I'm not going to generally think that they're the same quality type game as, say, like a Dark Souls or a Bloodborne, that kind of thing, where it's still based on... Sekiro's perfect example. It's based on the actual gameplay in difficulty. It limits what you can do. You can't block, you have to parry, right? So... the timing is more important. You have to attack when they're, you know, open for attack. Not just, you can't just keep slicing and just keep shooting through shields like you can in like a Destiny or an Outriders. But really what made me cement that this might be just actual bad game design is the fact that I was playing Outriders the other day, and I went to use my abilities, and even though I did the action to use my ability never spawned. So I'm specifically thinking of the Technomancer and Outriders. I threw out my my little turret, and the turret, like, I threw it out. I did the action of throwing it out. My cooldown even kicked into effect, but the actual turret never spawned and didn't shoot anything. So it was just a complete waste of time. I also have this like little freeze grenade that you put down, and it freezes everything in a 60-meter radius around you. I would throw that grenade down. None of the freeze would happen, so I would just get swarmed by all these enemies. Now, this is not difficulty increasing. This is literally base game, the actual coding of the game, and it's just not working, right? So, like, imagine you have a shooter game, you get a gun, and when you pull the trigger, the gun doesn't shoot, right? Like, this is, like, the absolute bare necessity to play this video game. Otherwise, why would you have the abilities? So, like, I mean... And it's not just like, it's not just that it just wasn't working, right? It's not a bug. I was able to like load out, load back in, and it was working again. But like, this is in the coding. You know, it'd be different if it was like, people literally pulling strings as I play these games, and one person just forgot to pull the right string, right? Well, no, this is the absolute innate writing of the game itself. You know, like, it can't not do these things because it's told to when you hit this button. like that's, I mean, it's a machine. It's not like a person missing a cue. It's supposed to happen. And for it to not, whether it's a bug or not, that's bad coding. You know, I mean, I turn on my PC computer and my PC turns on. Yes, every once in a while, if I open up like a third-party platform, there might be a crash because there's a disconnect between the operating system and the third-party system. But generally speaking, it crashes, I open it up, it works again. You know, like, or, you know, for whatever reason, it's got to do its little buffering thing, and then it works the kinks out, right? But it works. Whereas this just didn't work. Like, it went to do the action and just didn't do it. So it's not really a bug. That's just a lack of coding. And so, like, if you're going to make these games, why not make them to work? Whereas, like, okay, so maybe you're in a higher difficulty, and these enemies that are not that are supposed to spawn didn't spawn because you didn't make it that far into the event or whatever. That's one thing. But like, these are like basic game level things where you hit the button and it works. The reason that this bothers me so much is, like, having grown up in Nintendo and Super Nintendo and then through all the generations, not until we got into the quote-unquote next generation, a la PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, maybe even later than that, like Xbox One, PS4, did we run into these issues where you hit a button, nothing happens, or you get into a video game and it doesn't spawn this, or it doesn't spawn that, or this weapon, you know, doesn't show up when you go to swing it, and it doesn't do the motion, you know. And now I know they've got so much more to deal with, you know, especially because every game has to be a multiplayer game. So there's got to be some sort of like online aspect of it, and that can cause lag depending on people's connections to each server and whatnot. I get the little nuances, but like, again, we never had these problems growing up, right? On Super Nintendo, I never worried about choosing Chrono and Frog to do you know, cross strike and it not actually performing. Right? It was always going to do its thing. Zelda, same thing. Whenever I used the hook shot, it always shot the hook shot. It wasn't until like the last couple of generations that we started running into these bugs, and now it is hard to believe that it's not because of how we've seen society grow up, right? How does society work? You kind of have this new environment, niche little love for it, and so it's fairly successful, so you get a bunch of people to invest in this industry. And then all of a sudden the major corporations take a look at it, and they see all the money that can be made from these, and they immediately turn to profit instead of product incentive. And so instead of like taking time to create a good game, they do everything they can to make it as cheaply as possible and push it out as fast as possible to make as much money as possible. I mean, look at Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk was delayed like 17 times, and the game's still garbage. Now, I haven't even bothered to look into it, so it might be better now. But like, I mean, that game was delayed so many times. For it to come out and still have all the issues that it had, it's unacceptable, man. The Witcher, aka The Glitcher 3, Skyrim to a certain extent still has some issues, but like not nearly as much. So they, you know, and that's not even to say how many horror stories do we have about teams leaving products because they're not getting paid to make these games, right? Like, I can't tell you off the top of my head how many times I've seen or read an article about so-and-so leaving Project X. This team left Project Y specifically because they couldn't afford to work on it anymore because the company producing the game wasn't paying their employees. Or like, how many times do you hear about all these crunch time effects, like a la The Last of Us 2, just won best game of the year last year, but it basically was like a sweatshop to get that game done. And even on top of that, even though it was best game of the year, the story is utter garbage trash. Like, I mean, you could literally cut that game in half, and it would have been the exact same story. Literally the exact same story. Because you go back into it, and it's not one coherent story. It's Ellie, it's Abby, on the same exact adventure, told out in two separate moments that every so often connect together. Like, it's just piss poor creativity. How many, like, remakes do we have nowadays? Now, don't get me wrong. Absolutely love the Final Fantasy VII remake. But that's a little different case because it's a full-on remake. They went in, they added stuff. They went in, they made Midgar bigger. They expanded on the inner cities of the area. You know, so they didn't just like remake it in graphics. They didn't just remaster it. They recreated this game in a better, bigger formation. Even that, like, I don't even really have the problems with that. You know, now they do have like interruptions, so that's one thing. I didn't pick that up when I first started playing, so I would get upset that I would go to use a spell and it wouldn't use it because the enemy would then interrupt my attack. And I didn't realize that was a thing. And they have that in some games like Outriders as well. But at the very least, at least if I went to attack, my guy swung a sword. Right? I didn't go to use my ability, it does the action, and then just nothing happens. You know, like the Resident Evil remakes, remasters, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, they're slightly different, but they're basically just remasters of the same thing, and that's because I don't know, maybe they're just out of ideas. You know, in some cases, I think it's part of, you know, the idea of being able to keep the older games going throughout the generations. I know a lot of people, my friends included, don't like going back to old 16-bit games because they just look like old 16-bit games. Now, I happen to cherish that love because that's what I grew up with. I love the 16-bit sprite look. I love the 16-bit stereo system. To an extent, I even really, really appreciate the old Nintendo stuff. But games were designed to work, right? There wasn't an idea that, oh, well, we'll just release it and then we'll fix all the bugs with a patch 6 months down the road. They were built to be a product, not built to sell products. And we've kind of gone this way. You see it in capitalism all the time. As soon as something makes money, the idea then is to make as much money off of it, and you lose all that aspect of trying to make a quality product or a successful product. And in my opinion, just because you sell 100 billion, kajillion million units doesn't make it a successful game. That's not how we look at it as society, but I mean, if you put out utter gutter trash and everybody loves it just because it's named Fortnite, it looks funny, and everybody can play it for free, doesn't mean you made a successful game. I would not consider Fortnite a successful game. It's not good. Like, it's not a great game. It's, for a lack of a better term, it's it's PUBG with cartoon games, you know, with cartoon characters. And so it probably didn't take a whole lot to design it. You know, it probably took Epic almost no money whatsoever to create it. Now, I'm sure it probably takes money for them to keep it going and whatnot, but not nearly as much as they make on microtransactions. And it just proves my point that if you can survive on microtransactions alone, well, then you probably made a really cheap product. And it just, I don't know, it's kind of disheartening a little bit as a guy who's grown up with video games. Now, I mean, to be fair, on the flip side, maybe they're just too complicated nowadays. Maybe everybody expects so much out of every game that they just pack too much into these things. But it just doesn't seem to be that way, because we see short games come out all the time. I mean, Resident Evil 8 is only like 10 or 12 hours or something like that. And that's, I mean, the second or third longest game of any of the Resident Evil franchises. I think 4 is the longest at like 16 hours. I mean, shoot. I remember the days when I used to play like 100 hours worth of a game right before I was done with it. And so, like, you don't have to have a super long, complicated, deep understanding, varying difficulties of success to make a good game. Like, you can make a good game out of basic stuff. But the idea is, like, people seem to have this idea that, like, it's just not a good game unless there's some sort of moment where it wants you to pull your hair out difficult, or like, if you don't tell everybody's backstory for an additional 20 hours of gameplay, then it's not worth it. And it just kind of seems like laziness, in my opinion. You know, I mean, you see this with movies and TV shows on Netflix. Now, I happen to support Netflix a lot. I like Netflix a lot. But 90% of the movies out there are absolute gutter trash. My wife and I watched this movie that was fantastic with Amanda Seyfried, whatever her name is, right up until the end, and then all of a sudden it became this, like, incoherent babbling nonsense, because it's like, oh shit, we got to somehow wrap this movie up. Right? And so it's just, I don't know. I'm curious as to where people stand on this. I follow a guy on Twitch. He does have a channel here on YouTube as well called Osmongold. Fantastic fighting gamer. He plays a lot of Mortal Kombat, plays a lot of like Tekken and stuff like that. Very good at those types of games. I'm not very good at those types of games. But you know, I've heard him talk about this as well, where it's just not the same. And I'm generally curious as to, you know, people from my generation that came from the Nintendo, Atari, Super Nintendo era that play games now, in comparison to people that jumped in at, you know, PS3, maybe PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One. So, you know, who grew up with kind of this more capitalistic video game industry as opposed to the more industry version of Nintendo and Sega and stuff. So I'm generally curious as to what the answer might be. In my opinion, I still tend to think that it's lazy game design, but I'm open to the argument that maybe games have become too complex and they're just too difficult to keep building in this state, and because it needs to be fixed. You know, like we have way too many video games that come out that are just absolute poo-poo, and we need to, if we're going to be a viable industry going forward, you have to have the good ones out there, because the video game awards do not have enough clout to just say that The Last of Us 2 is the best game of the year, and that'll be the end all be all. Like, when people are waking up to the idea that award shows are just propaganda shows, and that's good, because that's what they are. Maybe at one point they used to actually mean something, but now it's a lot of cigars in the back room going, hey, you know what? I'd like to show you personally how good this game is. Why don't you come to my mansion in the Beverly Hills and, you know, I'll show you what the potential of this game is. And they have like 5 hookers in that house all ready to just gangbang you. That way you're more likely to say, hey, this is a great game. Like, I wish that was like a facade, but I mean, I've heard rumors in Hollywood that it might not be that far off. And the video game industry very much looks like it's kind of headed that way. So let me know what you guys think. Are games just too complex nowadays, and we're just gonna have to deal with the issues, or are they made shitty? Like, does it seem to you like we're just kind of living in a golden age of poorness, or maybe do you tend to believe that games have gotten to the point where they're so big that they're hard to maintain? Do me that favor, if you have a comment below, hit that like button, hit that sub button, hit that notification bell so you know when I do go live or drop a new video. Hit that comment section below, let me know what you think. If you happen to be across other platforms, I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch. Or sorry, yeah, Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch at BigSweetC as well. You can follow me over there. Either way, that's going to do it for this one. BigSweetC, that's me. Wishing YouTube, that's you. Wonderful day, night, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time of day it might be. Long as you're watching, I'm wishing you a wonderful watching time. Sweetness, signing off. Peace.